However the Bibles were supplied, they were supplied, and to this miracle the even greater one was added of the creation of a reading public for them. It is too little to say, as Harnack says, that by the universal zeal for Bible reading, quote, a powerful stimulus was given to the extension of the art of reading, end quote, and so, in an age of decaying education, the Church, quote, became the great elementary schoolmistress of the Greeks and Romans, end quote. The Church not only stayed the downward progress of education and increased the number of readers, but, by its demand that the Bible should be read by all ranks and classes and sexes and ages, introduced the principle of universal education into the world and advanced far toward making it a realized fact. The service of the Bible to the Greek and Roman people, the people as such, the submerged masses, as we say, was, therefore, hardly less than that which it rendered to the outlying barbarians, to whom it for the first time gave letters and a written tongue. It made them literate. Thus the Bible became the mother of truly popular education. Has there ever been a great revolution wrought in the intellectual history of the race? It is true that the conquest thus begun was not pushed steadily to its end. The ground gained was not even retained without interruption. After a while, a great misfortune befell the Church. It lost its Bible-reading public. Happier in this than the East, the West needed at first but a single version. It made no Punic Bible, nor an Iberian or a Celtic Bible, and the reason was that, bound together in the common use of the Latin tongue, the needs of all the Western peoples were met by the Latin Bible. But hardly had it fully possessed the field than the irruption of the barbarians swept away its literate public. Then began a long period of schism between the Church and the people, a Latin Church and an ever-increasingly non-Latin people. Little was done to close the constantly widening gulf. Rather, new theories, running directly athwart all previous Christian feeling and practice, were invented to justify it. The people could not be trusted with the Scriptures. The uncouth speech of the people was incapable of receiving and reproducing their sacred contents. The Latin language was holy, and its sounds fell with sacramental effect upon the ear. We appropriately call these somber years the Dark Ages. We are told nowadays, it is true, that there never were any Dark Ages. We rejoice that it is possible to paint them darker than they were. It is very largely a matter of point of sight. Christendom has never known a time, let us thank God for it, when the Bible was out of mind, when its teaching was not widely diffused and was not powerfully operative in the lives of men. There were schools in the Dark Ages, and the Bible was in a very true sense the textbook of these schools. There were libraries, in the capitals, in the universities, in the monasteries, and the Bible was to be had in these libraries. There were scriptoria, and the Bible was diligently copied in these scriptoria. A beginning was made already in the 8th century of translating the Bible into the vernacular languages, and by the end of the Middle Ages it was accessible to Frenchmen and Germans, Englishmen and Bohemians, Spaniards and Italians and Poles in their own tongues. Nearly 200 manuscripts of the German Bible and almost as many of the English from this later period remain today to attest the wideness of their use. Printing came in the midst of the 15th century, and W.A. Coppinger catalogues 144 editions of the Latin Bible for its first half-century, and for the 16th century no fewer than 438. But how many there were to whom all these Bibles were sealed books! How closely confined their use was to a class, the clerics, a few nobles, and in the later Middle Ages, the rising middle class of burghers. At a time when a German monarch almost passed for a cleric because he could read, we may imagine how it stood with the laity. And at a time when Bonaventura vainly applied the test of reading to a candidate for a bishopric, we may cherish doubts even of the mass of the clergy. The libraries of the late Middle Ages were well stocked with Bibles, and they were accessible to the student on very liberal terms. Gifts of Bibles were even made to libraries for the express purpose of being loaned to needy students. A striking evidence, this, of the scarcity of Bibles. But we learn from the old catalogues of libraries published by S. Becker, for example, that, quote, a royal foundation like St. Vaudreuil, about the year 800, did not possess a complete Bible, and Boniface had to be satisfied with parts. End quote. The manuals of biblical instruction used in the schools were nearly as bad as they could be. Luther calls them in that language more vigorous than elegant, in which he was wont to release his indignation, quote, the nonsensical, good-for-nothing, pernicious, monkish books, Catholicon, Grecista, Florista, and such like asses' dung. End quote. The famous Mammotrectus is a fair example. Composed by a Minorite at the end of the 13th or the beginning of the 14th century, it held its place in the schools until the end of the 16th. When the art of printing came in, such was the demand for it that it passed through at least 34 editions in the 15th century and was still being printed in 1596. Its author piously represents himself as pouring out the results of his studies as the Magdalene poured out the oil on the feet of his master. Employing another biblical illustration, Sixtus of Siena, less unctuously, but with more descriptive force, declares that, quote, like the poor widow who out of her want cast 2 pennies into the treasury of the temple, this brother brought to the temple of the Lord, in the poverty of his understanding, all that he had. End quote. When this was the nature of the provision that was made for the literate, we may fancy the condition of the illiterate, that is to say, of the whole mass of the people. Keep the eye fixed on the literate classes, and we may wonder whether the Dark Ages were quite as dark as we have been accustomed to think them. It is true that the Bible lay at the foundation of the entire social structure of the Middle Ages. It is true that it was everywhere in the background, and that it was working powerfully in the whole life of the times. It is true that it was everywhere accessible to those able to use it. Shift the eye to the masses, and a very different picture meets it. No doubt the Bible was not without its influence on the masses, too. But pervasive and powerful as that influence was, it was indirect, by percolation from above. The people had no direct contact with the Bible. It had become an esoteric book of which they knew only by hearsay. Their inability to read cut them off absolutely from all immediate approach to it, and the employment of Latin in the church services deprived them even of the opportunity to hear portions of it in the lessons. A very few, even of the literate, indeed, could ever hope to possess Bibles of their own. The size of medieval Bibles was immense. They were veritable libraries, deserving literally the current name by which they were known, bibliotheca, consisting of 4 or 5, in one instance of 14, great folio volumes. The cost of the production of these great books was naturally very great, and the price they commanded was prohibitive to any but very wealthy purchasers. If we understand S. Berger's account rightly, it was in the late 13th and early 14th century a very cheap Bible indeed, such as could only rarely be had, which cost as little as $75 of our money. The common price ran up to about $300. We know of such values as $500 to $900 being placed on them or actually paid for them, and even such as $1,800 to $2,000 in the 14th and 15th centuries. Bibles were left in wills as precious bequests. They were put in pawn for the performance of important services. They were given as security for large debts. Quote, one sees, remarks Berger, from these prices what we otherwise were aware of, that a country priest could not dream of possessing a Bible. End quote. The Bible had become the peculiar property not merely of the literate few, but of the few literate who were rich. The poor man could not have a Bible, and commonly lived and died without ever having seen one. The Bible had become to the people only a tradition.